DFS. It is Friday, September 23rd here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our Week 3 DraftKings podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schauf. With me, as always, is Jared Small. And Jared, I know that we like cheap quarterbacks on DraftKings every week. We like getting down in that 5K range, especially if there's upside because it gives us spending room elsewhere. I'm not sure, though, that I can get with Mac Jones for 5,100 in any format here. What about you?
Yeah, I saw him. He's popping as our top dollars per point on DK. Is that yeah? I mean, so
Yeah.
I do think you might need to go cheap at quarterback this week. This to me is, the pricing is much tougher on DraftKings this week than it has been the first 2 weeks. There's not a lot of cheap plays to like at running back and wide receiver. So the cheap quarterback I'd go with is Marcus Mariota for $5,500, 20.8 and then 16.4 DraftKings points the first 2 weeks of the season. And that came against the Saints and Rams, who are two, pretty tough defenses. He gets the Seahawks on Sunday. They're 30th in Football Outsiders pass defense rankings. And of course, Mariota has been giving us the rushing 88 yards on 18 carries. Both those marks rank third among quarterbacks. So he is the cheap option. I do love Jalen Hurts at his price, $7,600. So I might, mess around with it, try to go cheaper at other spots to get up to Jalen Hurts. But if you want to feel good about your running back and wide receiver plays, I do think you might have to go cheap with Mariota.
Yeah, I think it's always important to play around with the lineups and see what you can get to. Because sometimes you look at it and think, well, I'm not even going to pay for Jalen Hurts when I can do this for this much. But then you start actually messing with it and you're like, oh, okay, that actually makes sense. I can feel good about this as a cash lineup. But I agree. It's Marcus Mariota as a starting point for me. It's just easier for him to get to the floor than it is for Mac Jones because of that rushing. Mac Jones, I think, lacks the ceiling as well that Mariota has. And, that matters less for a cash lineup, but it still matters. We still are hoping to get as much as we can out of everybody. And I think Trevor Lawrence at 5,400 could be in the discussion, but I think his floor versus the Chargers is probably even lower than Mac Jones's, definitely lower than Marcus Mariota's. And then, $5,200 Jameis Winston might be in play if he weren't dealing with multiple injuries. So to me, I look at all that and it shakes out as Mariota is the starting point for cash lineups here. Beyond what he's done, Seattle's 25th in overall defensive DVOA. So it's a positive matchup for him. They're 30th against the pass. They're actually 9th against the run, according to Football Outsiders. Maybe that even further helps the floor and ceiling for Mariota, because if Atlanta's not able to run the ball effectively, on non-quarterback runs and has to lean pass more or lean on Marcus Mariota running the ball more, that only plays into both his floor and his ceiling cases for this game.
We have Mariota projected at just 2% ownership right now too. So I think he's an option for tournaments as well. I mean, I maybe he does have a higher ceiling than I'm giving him credit for because of the rushing. I struggle to see him get to 25, 26 DK points, which a lot of times you do need to win a tournament, especially on this slate where we have Josh Allen for the first time. We have Jalen Hurts in a great spot. We have Patrick Mahomes in a great spot. So I wonder if Mariota has the upside to win a tournament, but the savings he gives you and Drake London and Kyle Pitts are both good values. I think, considering Mariota in tournaments is, at least worth a look.
Yeah, that was my initial reaction. Is I don't think there's the ceiling for him to be my GPP quarterback, but if we take him at his price, you find Drake London at 5,800 with a 4% ownership projection right now. You can pair those guys together, and you always want ultimate ceiling from your quarterback and his receiver stack, but at those prices, we can buy that upside at other spots and make up for it. It's not going to be Kyle Pitts for me. I can, understand going for him, but I like Drake London and Marcus Mariota as a pair. Maybe not my primary, but certainly I think in the mix for building out those lineups. On GPP side, besides Mariota and whatever pass catcher you like, I think the Philly-Washington matchup is very interesting here. Jalen Hurts is obviously in play. You don't have to make the case for him. But if you want to go for the lower owned version of it, Carson Wentz, 6,300. So he's more expensive now because he's produced over the first 2 weeks, but also 2% ownership projection. You can still get into the Jalen Hurts game with Carson Wentz. If Jalen Hurts runs for everything, then he's not helping your Carson Wentz lineup. But play Carson Wentz. You can play a couple of his receivers. Curtis Samuel is still cheap enough. His ownership's going to be up, but he's still third in our DK dollars per point rankings. And, he gains some contrarian by using him with the quarterback if Carson Wentz goes off again. Terry McLaurin's projected for 2% ownership, and Jahan Dotson at 3% at $4,600. So if you don't want Curtis Samuel at the higher exposure number, you can go for Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson. You can get all these guys at currently 3% or less projected ownership. Get AJ Brown on the other side, who looks like he's going to be underowned versus what he's been in the Eagles offense so far. Really attractive matchup to kind of build around here.
Yeah, I definitely like the Eagles side of that game. You mentioned AJ Brown coming in at just 9% projected ownership. Dallas Goedert's coming in at just 6% projected ownership. So Hurts is going to be one of the most popular quarterback plays, but I think his stacking options, aren't going to be chalky. So I think that makes that stack attractive. Joe Burrow is my guy in tournaments this week, though. I just think it's a get right spot. People are off him, and rightfully so, with the start to the season for that Bengals passing game. But I think this is the spot where they're going against the Jets. Football Outsider says the Jets dead last in pass defense DVOA. They've allowed 7.8 yards per attempt and a 7% touchdown rate to Lamar Jackson and Jacoby Brissett over the first 2 games of the season. 4% projected ownership for Joe Burrow, and both T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are coming in pretty low too. So I'm going to stack those 3 up and run it back with probably Elijah Moore as my running back, because I believe he's cheaper than Garrett Wilson now, and he's also going to be much less owned. So I'm going to just kind of hope the pendulum kind of swings back in Elijah Moore's favor this week.
Yeah, I've got that stuff on my list for the FanDuel show. And I say run multiple lineups with both of those guys. Have Elijah Moore in one, have Garrett Wilson in the other. That way you don't have to say this is going to be the one or you miss out if it's the other guy, because there's certainly room to play both of those lineups. And I agree with that whole case for Burrow and his receivers. Running back for cash, Jared, it seems like it starts with Leonard Fournette. That's what our DK dollars per point say, $6,500, because he hasn't scored a touchdown yet. So we haven't gotten the big fantasy points to drive up his salary yet. Yeah. He was on the list last week. Terrible production fantasy wise, 74 total yards. As I said, no touchdowns so far, but 21 and 24 carries through 2 games, 23 and 26 touches. I mean, that's what we're chasing here. The touchdowns are going to come. The yardage matters less than the touchdowns. He's getting the opportunities, which is what we want. And he's at 6,500. He's still priced like somebody that is not getting that kind of workload.
For sure. I mean, I have concerns with the Bucs offense right now, with all the injuries, especially on the offensive line for Fournette. They have a 21.5 point implied total this week, but it's, with Fournette at $6,500, it's just like trust the process for cash games. A guy getting that much work at that price tag, and the matchup looks good. I mean, the Packers just got smoked by David Montgomery on Sunday night last week. They're 30th in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA. So I think again, like we saw last week with all these Bucs wide receiver injuries, you're going to see the offense run through Leonard Fournette this week.
Do you think that they got smoked by David Montgomery, or were they just like laughing and petting him as he ran because it didn't really matter?
Yeah, could be either.
David Montgomery, by the way, also an option here, 5,900 against the Texans. I've got Michael Carter down to 5,200 against the Bengals too, because I think I don't like the ceiling on him for a tourney lineup, but I think he's a pretty safe bet to get the opportunities, to get the touch volume, especially in the passing game. And when you put the price in with that, it can help you get to some other things. Whereas, some surer bet for production at running back are going to cost you.
Yeah. Montgomery's the cheaper guy that I like. And it's doesn't feel great relying on any Bear at this point. But I mean, Montgomery has been pretty good in spite of the Bears' offensive struggles. I mean, he has 32 carries and 6 targets through the first 2 games of the season. He played 80% of the Bears snaps last week. We saw the gap in playing time actually grow between Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. And the Bears are actually, home favorites in this game, something we're not going to be able to say for most of the season. So, that makes Montgomery's rushing volume a bit safer. I think, if you want to play Jalen Hurts, you're going to have to, go cheap at least one of these running back spots. I do think Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon at the end, in the 7K range, the upper 7K range, are both in awesome spots. But again, pricing is tight this week. So I don't know if you can play Cook, Mixon, and Leonard Fournette. I think you might have to get, one of those 5K backs.
Mm-hmm. And if you are going to lean on any Bear, it's the one where the coach says we're going to run it down their throats heading into a matchup with Green Bay. I would have to assume that that's the plan for going up against Houston as well. And, you mentioned their home favorites, kind of reluctantly so at 2.5 points.
Yep.
GPP side, Alvin Kamara gets interesting. We're going to watch his injury status heading into the weekend, but only $7,000 for now, only 4% projected ownership right now. That of course is early in the week for a guy that we're not sure about, the playing status. So that number might jump over the weekend. And if that's the case, I'll be less interested. But for right now, he's tied for 21st in ownership projection among running backs. Panthers 12th in total defensive DVOA, but they've been better against the pass than the run so far. And, we'll see exactly what Kamara's usage looks like. We only have one game so far to go on with these particular Saints, but we have to figure that it's probably going to be pretty high.
Yeah, and I would guess that Kamara's ownership is going to stay down just because he was disappointing in week one. Now he's dealing with the injury. So he is an interesting tournament play to me. Same kind of deal with DeAndre Swift. I mean, would not touch him in cash with the ankle thing. But Dan Campbell said Swift's in a better place this week than he was last week. He got into limited practice on Thursday, and just an awesome matchup against the Vikings, who are dead last right now in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA. So I think Swift 7,200 is interesting for tournaments. I like Miles Sanders too, 5,500, coming in at just 6% projected ownership. He has 8.5 and 11.6 DraftKings points in the first two games of the season. The only difference really is he scored a touchdown in the first game and didn't in week 2. But he gets a Washington D 31st in run defense, according to Football Outsiders. Washington has allowed 6.8 yards per carry to Jacksonville and Detroit running backs through the first 2 weeks of the season. So, to me, the Lions run game against Minnesota and this Eagles run game against Washington are two big mismatches this week.
Yeah, I'm not anti Miles Sanders, but the thing that will always keep me from getting excited about him for a tourney lineup is he's one of the worst bets to just control the goal line action for his team. There are 4 guys competing for goal line opportunities. Doesn't mean he can't get 2 of them in a single game, just less of a chance of him doing that than some other guys in similar roles overall. AJ Dillon's one more guy I want to throw out, and I have him down for tournament, but I think he's probably in play for cash consideration too. At 6K, he's got more expected PPR points so far than Aaron Jones, which speaks to the role that he's taking on, and not just as a runner, but also in the passing game. Single digit projected ownership, though, I think particularly makes Dillon a standout for tournament usage. And I doubt that it's going to climb that much, because even though we've seen Green Bay lean heavily on its running back so far, and logically they should continue to do so, we look at Tampa Bay, and over the past few years, the Bucs have been a matchup where we say, I'm scared to play my running backs against them. Doesn't look like that's the case this year. It's still developing, but they're 15th in rushing DVOA through 2 weeks. They're allowing 4.6 yards per carry to opponent running backs. And just looking at reality, Ndamukong Suh was a key part of that run defense for the past couple of years. He's not there anymore. They signed Akeem Hicks in free agency. He's injured right now, so he's not there. So, just looking at the group, it's like, oh yeah, I get why they might not be as good in run defense. I think AJ Dillon is an attractive guy for fantasy this week.
Yep, I had Dillon on my list here too for all those reasons you mentioned. And we have Aaron Jones coming off the big week 1 or big week 2, but it was Dillon who scored 20 DraftKings points in week 1. So I think those guys are just going to be rotating, big games throughout the season. And, coming off what we saw last week, Aaron Jones is going to be the more popular play on DraftKings this week.
Wide receiver, I think it's easier to find higher dollar guys to consider, Jared. So I'm primarily looking for cheaper guys to fit some of the more expensive things we want to do. I think Zay Jones is an option at 4K, but I think I like one of his teammates better at another position that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Does have 13 targets through 2 games. Mac Hollins, though, kind of similar to Zay Jones in that he's no lock for targets, but he's on the field a lot. He's even cheaper than Zay Jones, $3,300. And Mac Hollins sits 21st among all wideouts in total routes through 2 weeks, 8 targets the last time out. Now Hunter Renfro's got a concussion and sure looks like he's not going to be in for that game, which would only help the target outlook for Mac Hollins. And obviously at 3,300, we don't need him to do much to pay off.
Yeah, I actually had him on my list as a tournament play, but I do think I might mess around with him in cash flow just to see what that opens up, because $3,300 is a great price tag for a guy who's going to be on the field. 93% route rate for Mac Hollins last week, and I don't think that's going to go down with Hunter Renfrow out this Sunday. Russell Gage is the cheaper wide receiver I'm looking at. He's still dealing with a hamstring thing, but he ran her out on 81% of pass plays last week, saw an 18% target share, and that was with Mike Evans playing a lot of that game. We know Mike Evans is out this week. It looks like Chris Godwin and Julio Jones are going to be out too. So it's going to be Gage, Rashad Perriman, and Scotty Miller as the Bucks' top 3 wide receivers. So I think Gage is a good bet for like 8+ targets this week at $4,700. So I like him as the cheap play. And I think my other 2 spots are going to be guys in the 5Ks, or I guess I might go up to 6,100 with T Higgins, but I like Curtis Samuel at $5,100. I'm just buying this role as being legit, and he's not going to top 20 DraftKings points every week like he has the first 2 weeks, but 20 targets through 2 games. That's 13th most among wide receivers. He's also 13th in expected PPR points. And this Eagles defense likes to kind of keep everything in front of it in pass defense. They tend to give up a lot of short catches. We saw Amon-Ra St. Brown rack up a bunch of catches against them in week 1. So I think the matchup again kind of favors Curtis Samuel as potentially the target leader for Washington.
I would like to mention that I'm constantly dealing with hamstring issues as well. I haven't missed a show yet. So, we're all working through some stuff, Russ. Drake London, we mentioned with Marcus Mariota. We talked about it kind of in the GPP realm, but at 5,800, I think he's in play, whether you're using Mariota or not. The ownership projection does put him in contention for GPP lineups, but Drake London's been doing great on the target share front. As we mentioned, they're facing a Seattle defense that's been softer against the pass than the run so far. Believe he's 5th among wide receivers in target share, but I got that particular stat in my notes for the FanDuel show. On the GPP side, I mentioned the Philly-Washington matchup and all of the wideouts involved there. I agree with you that Mac Hollins is in play here. I think Marvin Jones, in addition to Zay Jones, are in play as cheaper options here. 41K or 4.1K for Marvin Jones, 4,000 for Zay Jones. I think Nelson Aguilar in the same range, 4,100. He's at 2% projected ownership, facing Baltimore, which has been the most friendly defense to wide receiver scoring and quarterback scoring so far. And also Jacoby Myers looks like he might not play in this game. So if that's the case, Nelson Aguilar might even be in play as that one of those cheap guys for a cash lineup. We'll see if his ownership level spikes if Jacoby Myers is ruled out for this game. But, those are some of the cheaper guys to, again, help me get to, I guess, the more obvious, more expensive players that I'm looking at.
Yeah, Aguilar's a good one. I had not considered him. I don't think I could click on his name for a cash lineup, but I think for tournaments in this matchup, if Myers is out, that he could be interesting. So I've talked about, I think all the wide receivers in the Bengals-Jets game to me, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, then Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson. Wilson still isn't projected for much ownership, despite his strong start to the season. So I think he's in play. Yeah. Drake London, you talked about. Michael Thomas is the other guy I have here. $5,900 still and 6% ownership. Like, people aren't, I guess, fully buying into Michael Thomas rebound yet. 22.7 and 18.5 DraftKings points the first 2 weeks. He has a 23% target share. He's 18th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points. He's not Michael Thomas of old, but I still think 5,900 is a bit too cheap for him. And then you factor in the ownership. I think he's a good tournament play.
Yeah, I agree. One more guy I want to mention is a teammate comparison here. Juju Smith-Schuster is at 14% projected ownership at $5,500. If we go down $800 in salary, and I bring it up only to make Jared uncomfortable, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, 3% projected ownership, $800 less in salary, got more targets than Juju last week. They're spending a similar amount of time on the field, and we know that he's got the downfield stuff. He's working shorter with the Chiefs than he did with Green Bay, but he's got the downfield ability to have those big plays. So I think a tourney lineup MVS at 4,700 is definitely in play.
Yeah, I didn't talk about Mahomes in the tournament quarterback session, but he is, going to be an option for me. Gus Bradley is the Colts defensive coordinator. He was the DC for the Raiders last year. And if you remember, Mahomes had 2 of his best fantasy games of the season against the Raiders. He went for 664 yards and 7 touchdowns on 9 yards per attempt in 2 games against the Raiders. So, if Bradley's running a similar scheme in Indy as he did with the Raiders last year, I think this could be a big Mahomes week. So I'm not sure I'll get to Mahomes, but I'm definitely going to want to be mixing in his wide receivers and Travis Kelsey into my tournament lineups.
2-game numbers for Mahomes sound like 1 game for Tua.
It's true.
Tight end cash. We had Juwan Johnson in play last week at 2,500. He only went for 4 catches, 40 yards on 7 targets. Not great, but that's usable at that level. That's more than 3x value when you're $2,500 in DK salary. He's up to 2,900 this week. I think he's still in play. I wouldn't say he's exciting or necessarily my main guy, but he's in play. Evan Ingram is the other Jaguar that I alluded to, unsurprisingly. $3,700 in salary for Ingram. The Chargers are just 18th in coverage DVOA against tight ends. We've got 4 and 7 catches from Ingram in 2 games so far. Nice setting for passing volume with them going in as 7-point underdogs here. And he's cheaper than Zay Jones at a position where it's, a little bit more difficult to find either sturdiness or reception upside. I don't think Evan Ingram's quite got the ceiling to be worth it for our tournament lineups, but I think in that vein of looking for cheap usability for cash lineups, Evan Ingram's a good fit.
Yeah, so I would love to be able to use Dallas Goedert at 4,700 or Tyler Higbee at 4,500 in cash lineups. But again, we have to save somewhere, and I think tight end is the place to do it in cash lineups. So Juwan Johnson is my guy right now. I think $2,900 is still too cheap for the usage he's getting. 12 targets through these first 2 games, a 16% target share. He's at, he scored 6.3 and then 8 DraftKings points, but he's underperformed versus usage. He's actually 10th among tight ends in expected PPR points. So not exciting, but I think he's gonna get me 6 to 10 DraftKings points in cash. That's fine at this price tag.
Yeah, not exciting but reliable is what we want in a PPR tight end here on DraftKings. It's like a tuna sandwich for lunch. Nobody's getting excited about a tuna sandwich, but it'll get the job done.
And he might have more upside than we're giving him credit for, because he's an athletic guy. He was a wide receiver back in college. He's already made he hurdled a defender in one of these first 2 games. I think it was week 1. So and it just takes, 1 30-yard touchdown from a tight end at $2,900, and he's a great tournament play. So I think he's in play for tournaments too.
Mm-hmm. I'll give him in play. On the GPP side, though, Travis Kelsey, his ownership projection looks low. He's down at 6%, $7,900. You mentioned the tight pricing, so it might just be that he stays down in that range. That certainly makes Travis Kelsey attractive, even if you're not playing Patrick Mahomes, who looks like he'll be one of the higher owned quarterbacks. Mark Andrews also headed for single digits here, Jared.
Yeah, I wish I remembered what podcast I was listening to earlier this week, but they were talking about the winning tournament lineups the first 2 weeks of the season, and it was 90% of the teams in the top 50 had Travis Kelsey in week 1, and then 90% of them had Mark Andrews in week 2, which goes back. I think I've talked about it too on one of these first couple pods, is trying to get up to these elite tight ends in tournaments, because they can give us 25 points where the rest of the tight end field is going to be scoring 8 and 10 points. You can get a huge edge in tournaments with the elite tight end. So I think Kelsey especially is worth getting up to. I think I'm not as excited about Andrews this week. The Patriots tend to be tough against tight ends, and they have limited Mark Andrews in their 2 meetings over the past few seasons. Darren Waller is the other semi-elite tight end that I like this week. $5,800. He's already off to a strong start this season. He's 3rd among tight ends in both expected fantasy points and actual PPR points. And then we have, if Hunter Renfro's out, that's 20% of the targets that are left behind. I think Waller picks up a chunk of those.
I'm still mad at Waller for coming in 1.5 yards below his yardage prop last week while averaging 8.3 yards per catch.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Looking at Mark Andrews did kind of bring me to looking at the Patriots receivers more. And I think if you are going to Mark Andrews, who is $1,000 cheaper than DK salary than Travis Kelsey, even if you don't want to play Lamar Jackson because he's so expensive and going to be among the higher owned quarterbacks, you could pair Mark Andrews with one of these cheap Patriots wideouts. I mentioned Nelson Aguilar earlier. We'll see if his ownership projection rises if there's no Jacoby Myers. But, for a tournament lineup, it's also worth considering Devontae Parker down at 4,000. It's headed for 1% ownership. The routes were down last week, but he was at 100% route rate in week 1. So yeah, especially if Jacoby Myers is out, he could get back up. And then Kendrick Bourne is 3,600. He's not going to be owned by anybody. He was up from barely being on the field in week 1 to 58% route rate last week. We've seen him be an efficient performer. And I mean, if we get a 4 for something and a touchdown from Bourne at 1% ownership at $3,600, then he's helping you.
Yeah, Bourne hardly played at all in week 1. It seems like he started to take some snaps from Devontae Parker in week 2. So we'll kind of see how that transit. I think Aguilar is the best player. It seems like he's the safest bet to be on the field for the majority of pass play. So I like that idea. I mentioned Goddard and Higbee as cash game values. Goddard's coming in at just 6% projected ownership. Again, we like this spot for Philly's passing game. Goddard 82 yards on 5 catches last week, and he had 2 or 3 catches called back by penalty. I would know because I'm watching every Dallas Goedert snap because I have so much of him. He could have cleared 100 yards. He did clear 100 yards last week. They just got called back by penalties. He's off to an encouraging start. And then Kyle Pitts, I mean, he's $4,800 and he's projected at 4% ownership. Like if we had said that a month ago, I would have been like, yeah, I'm playing Kyle Pitts in every single one of my tournament lineups. So I think he's worth playing at least a little bit.
I'd have been like, oh crap, the first 2 weeks are matching my fears for Kyle Pitts.
Yeah.
On defense, Carolina 2,600 pops first against the Saints. Eagles 2,900 against Washington with a lower ownership projection than I would have guessed. I think that one can work even in a Carson Wentz lineup. It's obviously not optimal to play your quarterback and the opposing defense, but we can get some Jameis Winston factor here and play a Wentz lineup with the Eagles defense. So I'm looking at those two first. I think, though, one other for potential differentiation is the Dolphins down at 2,200 against the Bills. Nobody wants to play a defense against the Bills, but that's almost minimum price for a defense that is at least talented. And we need only look back to last year to see the Dolphins limit the Bills to 314 total yards in Miami and 2 turnovers. The Bills still won that game 35-0, but the offense at least didn't go crazy in that game.
Yeah. The Panthers pop is clearly the best value in terms of dollars per point. So they'll be my cash game defense. The Saints have allowed the third most DraftKings points to defenses so far, and they haven't even given up a defensive touchdown yet. Though they've taken the second most sacks, and have the most giveaways in the NFL so far. So Jameis Winston has been being Jameis Winston. There's really no like other clear standout defensive plays this week, and the ownership kind of shows that there's no defense projected for more than 8% ownership right now. So to me, it's going to be a week where that as usual, it's going to be the last spot I fill, and for tournaments, I'm going to be making sure that my defense is not among the top at least 5 or 6 most popular defenses. I'm always trying to go different at that position.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all that. That'll do it for this week 3 DraftKings podcast. Head over to draftsharks.com now. You can play around with the lineup generator and build your own lineups on DraftKings, on FanDuel, on Yahoo. You can also find Jared's articles highlighting top picks for cash and GPP entries on DraftKings. If you're on the YouTube stream right now, stick around for about 15 seconds. We'll be back for the FanDuel talk. For Jared Smola and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schaff saying thanks so much for something with us. It is Friday, September 23rd here at Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our Week 3 FanDuel podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, Jared Small. And Jared, we talked about the 5K quarterbacks on DraftKings. We don't generally have to look down in the garbage cans for quarterbacks here on FanDuel. And that means that we can more comfortably play Jalen Hurts at 8,100. I'm going to guess he is also your starting point, right?
Yeah, the pricing isn't as tight on FanDuel, and also the gap between the top quarterbacks and the mid-range guys isn't as big. So to me, it's Jalen Hurts easily for cash games. Jalen Hurts through the first 2 games leads all quarterbacks in PFF passing grade and yards per attempt. So he's been great as a passer, and he leads all quarterbacks in carries, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns. So the guy is on fire right now. I think he's going to stay hot against the Washington defense, which has not looked good through the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, and then just comparing him to the other quarterbacks high in our FanDuel points or dollars per point projections, he's safer than Lamar Jackson for 500 less in salary because Lamar Jackson's got the right arm thing. The Washington defense is much softer than the Patriots defense. The Washington defense is also softer than what Kyler Murray's facing in the Rams, and he's at 7,800, so he's cheaper, but I'd much rather play Jalen Hurts there. Yeah. Safer on the injury front than Justin Herbert at 8,200, $900 cheaper than Josh Allen, projected for similar ownership. And then, the ceiling for Jalen Hurts is just more attractive than the guys that are way down in the 6K range. And we just, probably don't need to get down there in savings to make that worthwhile. On the GPP side, the ownership is probably going to be high for Jalen Hurts. And I think that is the only reason to, look in other directions. If we're spreading it around, certainly mix in some Jalen Hurts lineups in case he's just the monster for this week. But I think besides Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson certainly makes a lot more sense on this side because he is projected for less ownership. Rashad Bateman is projected for less ownership, although he's got an injury we're going to have to watch. I think Rashad Bateman's more attractive than Mark Andrews here as the stacking option if you do play Lamar Jackson. The Pats were toughest in the league in tight end coverage DVOA last year. Kyle Duggar's out for this game. likely one of their safeties. Adrian Phillips is not, though. And the biggest change to the Patriots defense from last year to this is that lead corner JC Jackson is gone. He's now a Charger. So they're not really a scary matchup for number one wide receivers at this point, the way they were over the past few years.
Yeah, I think you can always make an argument for these elite quarterbacks in tournaments. Kyler Murray is the one I'm semi-interested in on FanDuel. I mean, he's only $7,800. You know, he's like priced right there with like Joe Burrow and Kirk Cousins, who are actually on my list here as well as guys I like in their matchups. But like, you know, I think Kyler still beats those guys in ceiling because of the dual threat ability. And yeah, he's not in play for cash to me just because that offense is everything's just so hard for Kyler right now in that offense. It has not looked pretty so far, but he came through with a decent fantasy line in week 2. I think, you know, he's capable of doing that in spite of his, you know, supporting cast right now. So I think Murray is interesting in tournaments at his, you know, 6% projected ownership. Joe Burrow, talked about him on the DraftKings podcast. I just think this, you know, could be the breakout spot for the Bengals passing game, and all those guys are going to come in, you know, lower than expected because they've struggled so far. Kirk Cousins in a great spot against the Lions. The Vikings have the highest implied total of the week, but the Cousins is going to be pretty chalky. He's at 9% projected ownership right now, so I might actually end up not playing Kirk Cousins for that reason. And then one other guy who I think is in play for FanDuel, Derek Carr, $7,100 and 4% projected ownership. He gets the Titans. They're 26 in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA. And, you know, with Hunter Renfrow out, I mean, it hurts Carr, but I think it makes his target tree even more condensed. Where, you know, if I'm playing Carr, I'm stacking him with Devontae Adams and Darren Waller, and, you know, hoping those two guys account for like 70% of Carr's passing production.
Yeah, I can get behind that. One other guy who's not going to be a focal point for me, but I think is worth considering for a couple of lineups, Trevor Lawrence, headed for 1% ownership. He's got Christian Kirk as the clear number one receiver. You can add him with one more. There are multiple options for that. There are options for Chargers run backs. I think it gives you an entry point to this Chargers Jaguars matchup without having to bet on the rib injury for Herbert, and Herbert's going to be much higher owned. So, you know, you can get in on this one if it is a high scoring game overall. Certainly don't trust Trevor Lawrence to deliver